Now we come to Isaiah. Whoa, we come to the prophets. What can you say about Isaiah? It's an amazing book. Maybe it's the greatest book in the Old Testament. I want to mention here a new book out on Isaiah, which I just finished. Maybe you've seen it, by Andrew Abernathy, an Old Testament scholar from Australia. But I think he's teaching at Wheaton now, but he's Australian. The Book of Isaiah and God's Kingdom, which is in the New Studies of Biblical Theology series. All those books with the gray cover, edited by Don Carson. So the book by Morales on Leviticus is in the same series. So that series is really excellent. By the way, Jim Hamilton has a book in that series on Daniel. So this is a fascinating book, and he emphasizes, I like this book because it came out after mine, of course, because it just came out, and he emphasizes that one of the main themes of Isaiah is the kingdom. Oh, he's a wise person, isn't he? So anyway, so many things we could talk about on Isaiah, but just hit some high points. And obviously, God's judgment of Israel is a major theme. In chapters 1 through 37, if you looked at the book as a whole, chapters 1 through 37 focus on Assyria, right, the Assyrian kingdom, and Israel, and especially Jerusalem. So remember the Assyrian Empire, if you know your history. The Assyrian Empire captured the northern kingdom and put it in exile in 722 BC. And it took over almost all of Judah and was besieging Jerusalem, but did not succeed. Right? So that's the big picture. 185,000 were slain by the Lord as they were outside the city, and then they left. And Isaiah's all about, the main point of the first 37 chapters is Jerusalem will be spared, despite Israel's sin. But of course, the Jerusalem was spared, but the country as a whole was devastated by Assyria, as it was taking city after city, and coming up, as Isaiah says, coming up to the neck. You remember that image? Coming up to the neck of the land, and the head's the capital, right? So it almost took the whole country. The punishments are covenantal. Leviticus 26, 27, and 28. I like what Abernathy says about Israel's sin. Israel is stupider than a donkey. It's a prostitute. They're God's enemies, and it's a vineyard producing putrid grapes. So that's why the judgment came. Abernathy especially emphasizes Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah chapter 6, where you have the throne room vision, right? That great chapter of Yahweh. He has a vision, right? And the year King Uzziah died, he has a vision of Yahweh in the temple. The vision of Yahweh in the temple is Yahweh is king, right? He's the king in the temple. And the hem of his robe signifies his royal authority. He sits on the throne. He's the Holy One. Again, Abernathy says the smoke in the temple connotes God's theophanic presence, perhaps even his anger at his people. And he also argues that the seraphim being present there signify God's judgment on his people. So no wonder Isaiah, speaking of himself but representing the nation, says, "Woe is me," with the great holiness of God. In terms of canonical links, it's most interesting, isn't it, that John argues that what Isaiah saw Jesus, right? He saw Jesus' glory. Clearly, he has to be talking about Isaiah chapter 6. So we see clearly in John that the revelation of Yahweh is also the revelation of Jesus. I don't think the conclusion is he didn't see Yahweh, but he saw Jesus. I think the conclusion is fundamentally Trinitarian, isn't it? At the end of the day, when you see God, you see the Lord. So again and again and again in the New Testament, kurios passages about Yahweh are applied to Jesus Christ. And we see John do that. So we see much about Israel's evil. I'm not focusing on that because I want to look at a couple passages because I think the hermeneutical passages will be interesting to look at. We see the day of the Lord as one of judgment and salvation. Day of the Lord is a huge theme in the prophets, right? Chapters 24 through 27, those are important chapters, aren't they? They focus on universal judgment. Chapter 34, the judgment of Edom. Edom sort of represents all the ungodly nations that God will judge. So I want to come back to that, at least some of the passages. So that's just very general. Jerusalem's salvation will be through the king. So Jerusalem will be spared even though she's a whore. Quite remarkable. I already mentioned Assyria coming up to the neck. But let's dip down a little bit. And this is a controversial passage. People go different ways. Let's go into Isaiah chapter 7 and 8. Because I want to do, so I'm doing a little bit of Matthew here at the same time, okay? I'll do a little bit of Matthew and Isaiah because it's helpful to do it when we're looking at the Old Testament passage. And this is where we see biblical theology at work. Of course, Matthew argues that you see a fulfillment in the birth of the Virgin. So you see, the king is Ahaz, and Ahaz is evil king. So Aram and Ephraim together were conspiring against Ahaz. So let's just say for Aram is Syria, right? Ephraim is the northern kingdom, and they're conspiring against Judah, and the people are terrified, verse 2. Isaiah goes out with his son, the remnant shall return. That's what his name means, right? And he says, don't worry about the leaders, Rezin of Aram, of Syria, and the son of Remaliah, Pekah, who's the leader in Israel. Don't worry about them. They've plotted against you. They say they're going to go up to Judah and put in Tabeel's son as king. They say, Ahaz, they're going to displace you as the ruler. But the Lord says it's not going to happen. The chief of Aram is Damascus. So Damascus is the capital city of Syria. The chief city of Damascus is Rezin. Within 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. So the basic point is, right, Israel and Syria will be destroyed by whom? Well, by Assyria, right? Don't worry about them taking over you, Judah, because I'm going to judge them. Remember, the people are terrified. They're terrified about this threat. So then the Lord says to Ahaz, ask for a sign from the Lord your God. It can be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven. But Ahaz replied, I will not ask and I will not test the Lord. That sounds very spiritual, doesn't it? No, I don't need a sign. I'm just fine. But it's clearly from unbelief. How do we know that? From the subsequent words, right? I mean, if you're reading that out of context, you might say, oh, how wonderful Ahaz is. He doesn't need to see a sign. Even Jesus himself would commend him for that, right? No. Isaiah said, listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of God? God's not pleased. God is not pleased at all with what Ahaz does. Ahaz is a wicked king. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Okay. See, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel, God with us. So that's the prophecy. By the time, now, so here we go. I can predict that not all of you are going to agree with what I'm about to say. But that's why I want to look at this. We can have some good conversation maybe. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. Now, who's he talking about? The son talked about here, right? He'll have a son and name him Emmanuel. By the time he knows the difference between good and bad, he'll be eating curds and honey. Okay. What's that mean? Well, we have to keep reading. For before the boy knows how to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. Before this boy is old enough to tell the difference between good and bad, Syria and Israel, the northern kingdom, Ephraim, will be destroyed. So my argument is, given what this prophecy is, this prophecy is fulfilled in Isaiah's day. That's the normal. I am reading the text in its Old Testament context. Now, I'm not done yet. The Lord will bring on you, your people, and your father's house such a time as has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah. He will bring the king of Assyria. So I'm not making this up, right? The judgment is coming from Assyria. On that day. So he's saying to Ahaz, don't worry. He's saying to Ahaz and Judah, don't worry, God is with you. Here's the sign. A son's going to be born. Before that son's even old enough to know right from wrong, Assyria is going to sweep down and take Syria, Aram, and Israel, and your threat will be gone. Of course, now you'll have to worry about Assyria. That's another story. On that day, the Lord will whistle to flies at the farthest streams of the Nile and to bees in the land of Assyria. Now, he's speaking of the enemies that will come, right? The Assyrians are going to be like bees that the Lord invites to come. They'll come and settle in the steep ravines and the clefts of the rocks and the thorn bushes and in all the water holes. They're going to come and invade your land like insects, like bees that are everywhere. That's talking about the Assyrians. Even when he says the Nile, I think he still has in mind the Assyrians. I think he's just using imagery of a foreign nation there. This thing's really wanting to fall off me. It's pulling at me anyway. On that day, the Lord will use a razor. So, he keeps saying the same thing over and over again. Is it not working very well? Because I've been adjusting it so much. Yeah. I think it's okay. I can bring it back. Is that better? Or do I need to pull it in more? Is that okay? Is that good enough? Bring that in. How's that? Okay. On that day, the Lord will use a razor hired from beyond the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria. So here we are again. To shave the beautiful image, right? To shave the hair on your heads, the hair on your legs, and even your beards. So it's going to be a shaving operation, right? The judgment's compared to shaving. He's going to shave all your hair off. So what's going to happen? On that day, a man will raise a young cow and 2 sheep, and from the abundant milk they give, he will eat curds. For every survivor in the land will eat curds and honey. Aha! Right? Remember what we read? By the time that young boy that's born learns to reject the bad and choose what is good, he will be eating curds and honey. Well, there it is. How soon is the judgment coming? Or what will happen when the judgment comes? When Assyria comes, what people will eat are curds and honey. On that day, notice he keeps repeating on that day, every place where there are 1,000 vines worth 1,000 pieces of silver will become thorns and briars. A man will go there with bow and arrows because the whole land will be thorns and briars. You will not go to all the hills that were once tilled with the hoe for fear of thorns and briars. Those hills will be places for oxen to graze and for sheep to trample. In other words, the vineyards are going to be gone. The vineyards are going to be gone. What is there going to be left to eat? curds and honey. The vineyards are going to be destroyed. Then the Lord said to me, take a large piece of parchment and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. Nice name, right? What? Swift is the punishment, swift is the prey, it means. So his name stands for the punishment coming. I have appointed trustworthy witnesses, the priests Uriah and Zechariah, son of Jeberechiah. I was then intimate with the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. The Lord said to him, name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz. I believe that this child is the fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah 7:14. So a child is born very quickly to a young maiden, right? And it's this boy. For before the boy, I think it fits with chapter 7, before the boy knows how to call father or mother, before he knows the difference between right and wrong, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carried off to the king of Assyria. So these things will be fulfilled. And then he says again, the Lord will bring against them the mighty rushing water of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria in all his glory. It will overflow its channels. Here's another image of the judgment. It's like a river overflowing its channels, spilling over its banks. It'll pour even into Judah. It'll even come up into your neck. It'll fill your entire land. Emmanuel. But God is with us, and Jerusalem won't be taken. So he says, God's with us. Emmanuel. Don't call a conspiracy what these people call a conspiracy. Don't worry about Ephraim and Syria. Don't fear what they fear. Fear the Lord. And so forth and so on. So, that's my take on what Isaiah had in mind. That the prophecy was fulfilled in his day. But why does Matthew appropriate this prophecy then? And I think we're going to see other examples of this in Matthew. Not all of Matthew's prophecies are straight line prophecies. You know, I know most evangelicals take this as just a straight line prophecy and not being fulfilled at all in Isaiah's day. And of course, that's possible, isn't it? It's possible it is a straight line prophecy. But I think it's unlikely given the flow of thought in Isaiah chapters 7 and 8. I think the problem with that reading is I don't think it accords well with the Old Testament context itself. So how do we explain what Matthew is doing? We'll return to this when we come to Matthew again, how Matthew appropriates the Old Testament, but I would argue that Matthew argues typologically. Matthew finds a typological relationship between God's promise in history and the fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And when you have typology, there's escalation. So there's a pattern and a correspondence. There will be a son who is born, but this son will not just be born to a maiden, but this word can also mean virgin, right? This son will be born to a virgin. And so there will be a greater birth and a greater fulfillment and a greater sign. I would argue that for Matthew, that's part of the way prophecy functions. Prophecy isn't only, in Matthew, a straight line prediction, but it also, prophetic passages are typological. So, there you have it. Anything you want to say about that? Any questions, comments? I'll show you other examples of this in Matthew when we come to Matthew.
Our Old Testament professor said the same thing, but I think he actually went a step farther and said that all prophecies in the prophets were had a partial fulfillment during their time. What do you think of?
What about the birth of the promise of Bethlehem? The Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. How is that partially fulfilled?
I don't know. He made this statement, but he might not have said all of the prophets.
But
yeah, he said a large chunk of all of them.
Okay, so he basically agreed with my interpretation. Super. Wonderful.
He also signed your book, so.
Yeah. Praise the Lord. So maybe that's not controversial. Good. Yeah.
So the virgin in Isaiah 7, should be correctly translated as maiden, not as actual literal virgin.
No, I actually think it does mean maiden here. But the word can also mean virgin, right? Parthenos. You're right, right. Yeah.
Obviously, that's not inspired.
Yeah, but it's a matter of ultimately of both and, because a maiden can be a virgin, right? So there's room in the meaning of the word for both readings, I think. The semantic range of that word is such that, so translating it virgin isn't so much wrong, but in the particular context, I think he has in mind to maiden. Yeah. Anything else there? So one example in Isaiah that we're looking at, a huge theme in Isaiah is the remnant, right? The remnant, I would argue, is represented in the king. So this is very important as well. The judgment is coming, Isaiah 6, but the holy seed is the stump. So, basically the whole country is cut down. But all that's left is a stump. But I would argue for Isaiah, the remnant, a shoot will grow from the stump of Jesse. The remnant focuses on a king, particularly. A branch from its roots will bear fruit. It looks like as if it's the end. Now, I'm not saying in Isaiah the only person left is the king. You have Isaiah and his children and so forth and so on. But the remnant centers on, for Isaiah, the promise of the remnant centers on the king himself, finally. So I think that's very important. So, of course, we have Isaiah 9, right? So there's a new David, there's a king coming. I give some of these passages. You see the branch of the Lord is coming, so forth and so on. You see in chapter 9, 2 through 7, this passage, a child will be born for us, a son will be given to us, the government will be on his shoulders. Now, that relates to what you just said. I would tend to see that passage in chapter 9, I'm open to this, but I would tend to see that passage in chapter 9 as a prophecy fulfilled, that I would take that passage as being fulfilled in Jesus, not anybody beforehand. Maybe someone beforehand too, but the extent of the blessing anticipated in chapter 9 and 11. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I definitely see that in chapter 7, but in chapter 9, the dominion will be vast and its prosperity will never end. So, yeah. And the same with chapter 11. So it's very, very interesting, isn't it? The New Testament picks this up. Jesus, I shouldn't say Jesus, the Messiah is spirit anointed, right? So that, of course, the New Testament picks up that theme big time. And when the Messiah comes, you have a new creation as well. That whole new creation theme that's coming. An infant will play beside the cobra's pit, and a toddler will put his hand into a snake's den. We see this in chapter 32 and 33. A king will reign righteously. He'll be like a shelter, a refuge. And again, we see the new creation, don't we? The palace, chapter 32, the palace will be deserted, the busy city abandoned. The hill and the watchtower will become barren places forever, the joy of wild donkeys and a pasture of flocks. Until, so here's a promise of the Spirit from on high is poured out on us. Then the desert will become an orchard, and the orchard will seem like a forest. Then justice will inhabit the wilderness, and righteousness will dwell in the orchard. The result of righteousness will be peace. The effect of righteousness will be quiet confidence forever. So there'll be a new creation that's coming. And then I got my book title from this text, right? Your eyes will see the King in his beauty when these promises are fulfilled. Now, I'm thinking here, I might not be able to do it. So they'll put their hand in the snake's den. No, that didn't work, what I wanted there. I might not find what I'm looking for. I wanted to do an experiment in case I could find it. No, that didn't work either. Just be patient with me for a moment. If it doesn't work, I'm not going to say anything. Yeah. I'm not going to bother with it, just given I can't find it right off. All right. We also see in Isaiah a new exodus and a new creation. So one of the most prominent themes in Isaiah, especially 40. So I should stop and say, because I haven't done this specifically, I should stop and say, right, chapters 1 through 37, just to get our bearings. Isaiah is a huge book, isn't it? So chapters 1 through 37, right, are about Assyria and Jerusalem being preserved, right? Big picture. We all want to see the big picture. 38 through 66, I take it Isaiah's one book by one author, incidentally. But Isaiah 38 through 66 is about Babylon, isn't it? So, and especially after exile. So I take it that Isaiah 38 through 66 is much of its prophecy, right? Of what's to come. That's what I keep having problems with this, don't I? That's what separates. Is it getting too far away again? Is that okay? Yeah, that's better. But Isaiah 38 through 66, what separates Yahweh from false gods is that he knows the future, that he can predict what will happen before it takes place. But anyway, Israel's going to be exiled to Babylon, and Isaiah 40 through 66 promises there's a new exodus, right? And there's a new creation coming. So the first exodus becomes a type and a pattern of a new exodus, a second exodus. This exodus will be from Babylon. So a big theme in this part of Isaiah is Israel is coming back, and when it comes back, there will be a new creation. So when you have so let's look at some of these themes, right? The blind will see and the deaf will hear. Well, that's the new creation, isn't it? Of course, we immediately start thinking of Jesus, though, when we hear this, don't we? The desert will become fruitful. There'll be no more enemies. There'll be no more sickness. The desert will blossom like a crocus, which is a flower, right? Again, the blind, the deaf, and the lame and the mute will be healed. There'll be streams in the desert. The ransomed of the Lord will return and come to Zion. That's the new Exodus, isn't it? That's the return. Israel will be forgiven. There's going to be a highway in the desert, right? Those are the words, right? We're not reading these, but those are the words of John the Baptist, aren't they? You're going to return. The new Exodus is the gospel. Proclaim good news to Jerusalem. Remember that? What is the new Exodus? It's the gospel. The good news, Jerusalem will be delivered. Israel will be delivered. The blind are going to be led. You're going to turn darkness to light. You're going to make the rough places level. The new Exodus is Israel's redemption. God's going to do a new thing. He's going to make a way in the wilderness. That's returning from exile, right? He's going to part the waters as in the first Exodus. He's going to bring Israel from the ends of the earth for the glory of his name. Well, the ends of the earth is returning from where? From Babylon. Again, Isaiah 51, Israel will leave Babylon. There's going to be a new heavens and a new earth. The wolf and the lamb will lie down together. The serpent will be crushed. There it is, right? There's our promise. The serpent's going to be crushed in that new creation. Isaiah 65:25. There's going to be a new Exodus. There's going to be a new creation. There's going to be a new Jerusalem. Jerusalem's going to shine. Anticipating Revelation 21 and 22. The wealth of the nations will go to Jerusalem. Israel's sanctuary temple is going to be beautiful. The Lord will be your light. Jerusalem will be restored. It won't be forsaken. Now, we're going to leave some of this till we come to the New Testament in terms of how it's appropriated. But here's the point I want to make. Was this promise fulfilled? Yes. They came back, didn't they? 536 BC. They returned. But, yes, but, right? What's the answer? Yes, but. Yeah, or even yes and no. Was the promise fulfilled? Yes, but not in this way, right? They came back, but was it the new creation? Were all these promises fulfilled to the extent that we see here? No, and they weren't. They weren't. We'll come back to that again. Because these promises are stunning, aren't they? I mean, these new creation promises. But even the new Exodus promises, they're not fulfilled in their fullness. So, we'll come back to that. Now, here's the other thing. Just big picture again. Why was Israel in exile? What does Isaiah say over and over and over again? I'm not looking at the text because of their sin, right? Why were they in exile? Because they sinned. For them to return, say they failed to keep the Lord's law, right? But Isaiah 40 through 66 says they're going to return because Yahweh's going to forgive their sins. But who is the servant of the Lord? The servant of the Lord plays a huge role here. And I'm sure you're all familiar, but you, Israel, my servant. So the servant songs play a huge role. Israel, my servant, Jacob, whom I've chosen. So Israel, Jacob's just in the Hebrew parallelism, right? You're my servant, Israel. Clearly. He says to the people. Isaiah 45:4. My servant Jacob, and Israel, my chosen one. We see that again. Israel is a flawed servant. Who is blind but my servant? Or deaf? like the messenger I'm sending? Who is blind like my dedicated one? The blindness here is a moral failing. Israel is God's servant, but it's a flawed servant, sinful servant. The Lord promises to save his servant Israel, and they'll be his witnesses. So the servant is clearly Israel, but the servant is Israel, but the servant transcends Israel. The servant, you're familiar with these passages, the servant is endowed with the Spirit, and he brings justice and light to the nations. He won't break a bruised reed. So that's a great passage, isn't it? 42, 1 through 4. I love that passage, which Matthew appropriates, doesn't he? How is the servant going to bring victory? You're not going to hear his voice in the streets. You know, it's the ancient world. Well, it's in the modern world too, right? Warfare's in the streets. It's not going to be like that. He's not going to even break the bruised reed. The wick that is flickering and about to go out, he's going to preserve it. So you all know that book by Richard Sims, The Bruised Reed. Have you all read that? That is a great, great book. That's a very pastorally warm book. So if you haven't read it, it's a very short little book. You can get it in the Puritan paperbacks from Banner of Truth, The Bruised Reed. Read that book. I mean, just for pastoral ministry, read that book. You're going to find it very, very strengthening for yourself and for your people. A great, great meditation on this text. So Israel is the servant, but the servant transcends Israel because the servant's going to bring Jacob and the remnant back to the Lord. Israel can't bring itself back, right? Do we have exegetical, hermeneutical warrant for saying the servant transcends Israel? I think we see it right here. The servant's going to bring Jacob back and bring the remnant back to the Lord. In fact, Isaiah 53, and I don't need to linger on this, the servant atones for the sins of Israel. Well, Israel can't atone for its own sins. You know, you all know, you know, I've had students do this. I haven't done it myself, but they go talk to Jewish rabbis about Isaiah 53, and they say, it's Israel. It's Israel. It's not about Jesus, it's about Israel. And I've even had students surprised at this, if they haven't studied, because they take them to the earlier passages in Isaiah, and they say, the servant's Israel. It's not Jesus, it's Israel. So, Isaiah 53 is talking about Israel. Yeah, it is talking about Israel. But the servant is Israel, but transcends Israel. Because it makes Israel can't atone for its own sin. And furthermore, we have a lot of exegetical reasons. The servant's innocent. Israel as God's servant is in exile. Isaiah tells us over and over and over again for their sin, right? They're in exile for their sin. But this servant in Isaiah 53 is not suffering for his own sin. He's bearing the sins of others. A sinful Israel can't atone for the sins of Israel. and this is not sinful Israel. So you've got to account for that. I mean, you could say Isaiah's just contradicting himself, right? First he says they're sinners, and now he says they're innocent. But clearly he's drawing a distinction. It's the servant who atones. Now this is what I want to argue here. I want to argue that what we're seeing here in Isaiah is what we've seen all throughout the Old Testament. We see the blessing's going to come through the offspring of a woman. The blessing's going to come through the offspring of Abraham. But it's Isaac and not Ishmael. It's Jacob and it's not Esau. And it's Samuel and it's not Hophni and Phinehas. I'm just speaking generally now. It's David and it's not Saul. It's the remnant. It's not the disobedient. But finally, it's the servant. It's the servant. Individually. It's Jesus. Who is the true Israel, finally? It's Jesus. It's Jesus. Isn't that what Paul says in Galatians 3:16? Is he just making it up? Who's the only seed of Abraham, finally? Well, the only one who ever obeyed. That's who. Paul's just not pulling that out of the air, right? The only true servant at the end of the day is the only one who ever obeyed. And who was that? It's in Isaiah itself. It's the only one who can atone for the nation. Finally, forgiveness comes through an individual servant, the true Israel. And there's indications that the servant is tied to a royal figure. So he's the son of David. The servant is the king. So we see that narrowing. This servant is the one endowed by the Spirit. So he's the king, right? Chapter 11. So you see the connection Isaiah makes? The king in chapter 11 is endowed by the Spirit. Well, so is the servant. Both the king and the servant bring about the new creation. Isaiah 11, the king and the new creation. See that theme in Isaiah 11? King and new creation. So too in Isaiah 40 through 66, the servant and the new creation. So he's telling us the servant's a king. The servant's going to fulfill the covenant. And therefore, the promise to Abraham that the blessing would go to the ends of the earth is going to happen through the servant. Did Isaiah fully understand what he was saying? I don't think so. Does it violate what Isaiah says? Certainly not. I think Isaiah understood part of what he said, but it's a prophecy fulfilled and a mystery revealed. Certainly Isaiah didn't understand totally what he was talking about. So, all kinds of passages in Isaiah about the inclusion of the Gentiles, right? Gentiles will stream to Jerusalem. The return from exile. Now, yeah, people interpret this different ways. I see this fulfilled in the new covenant. In Isaiah, when it says the law will go forth from Jerusalem, I understand that to be the proclamation of the gospel from Jerusalem from the day of Pentecost on. Egypt and Assyria are included. Do you remember that? In chapter 19? So, the kings will understand. David will be a witness to the nations. On and on it goes. So many passages. Let me just read one of them. Some passage we might not get to, but come gather together and approach you, fugitives of the nations, those who carry their wooden idols and pray to a God who cannot save, have no knowledge. Speak up and present your case. Yes, let them consult each other. Who predicted this long ago? Who announced it from ancient times? Was it not I, the Lord? There is no other God but me, a righteous God and Savior. There is no one except me. Therefore, turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. There's the nation. For I am God and there is no other. So we see that universal call for all to be saved. Well, so many things we could talk about in Isaiah, but just hitting those high points. Anything you want to say? Yeah.
So we're getting to the idea that Israel is a servant, right?
Yeah.
So how do you figure out which passages about the servant refer specifically to Israel and which ones refer to Jesus in the future? And how do you differentiate which ones are which?
I would say every passage that says Israel is the servant refers to Jesus as well, unless it says the servant sinned in those passages. Right? When he talks about the sin of the servant, that's got to be restricted to historical Israel. All the other passages, I would say, because Jesus is the servant. Jesus does represent the nation. Then the passages that cannot refer to historical Israel are the passages that predict forgiveness of sins through the servant, and the passages that say he will restore Israel, and the passages that say he'll bring in the Gentiles. I think none of those can refer to ethnic Israel, because those blessings will only come through an obedient son. And for Isaiah, I think that means perfect obedience. If you look at the streamline of biblical theology, what's the story? It's not David, as good as he was, because he was flawed. There is no other person. It's not Moses. He was a sinner. So the blessings, the covenant blessings that are promised, they only come through Jesus. That's what I'd say. Yeah. Anything else you want to say? They only come through the perfect servant of the Lord. And of course, that fits very nicely with the New Testament, doesn't it? Any comments on Isaiah? Yeah.
I'm curious, you say that Isaiah didn't really understand all of what he was saying. Would you see, in terms of an authorial intent idea, his intent is kind of what's immediately there, and then God, I know you said you don't want to drive a wedge between, obviously, God's intent and the author's, but God has more of the picture, obviously, and so it's there even though Isaiah doesn't see it, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Clearly, Isaiah teaches that there's a servant of the Lord who would forgive our sins. I'm just asking, did Isaiah really understand fully what he was saying? Maybe. He could have. But I don't think he had to. I mean, at least from 1 Peter 1, 10 through 12, we seem to have an indication that the prophets didn't fully grasp all that they were saying, but they looked forward to the fulfillment. But I think things were clearer after the fulfillment. So this is a hard question, isn't it? I'm not arguing that the fulfillment is such that I think it's sort of like when it's fulfilled, Isaiah would have said, aha, that's what I was saying all along. Of course, that fits with everything I was saying. But did he see the fullness of what he was saying? Probably not. But nothing that was fulfilled was contrary to what he was saying. He wouldn't have said, well, that doesn't relate to what I was saying in my book at all. I mean, that's just totally separate. So there's an integral, organic relationship. But in terms of his own consciousnness of the fulfillment, it's a little bit hard to know. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. Yeah. Anything else on that? Okay, let's do Jeremiah. Is Jeremiah the longest book in the Old Testament? Isn't that true? Yeah, I'm reading Jeremiah right now in my devotions, and man, some of those chapters are long. I mean, great, right? But it's a long book. So I try to read. I don't always do this, but I try to read my Bible, and everybody's different, right? I try to read for my devotions. I try to read one chapter in Psalms and Proverbs in English every day, 2 chapters in English in the Old Testament every day, one chapter in the Greek New Testament every day. I've done that since 1976. That's a great way to learn Greek, right? Just read it. Now it depends on where you are. And then I try to read. I don't always fulfill this one, but most days I do, though. Depends on what's happening. But I try to read one chapter every day in the Hebrew and the LXX. But I put that one up. I cheat. Don't tell your Old Testament professors. But I cheat. I put it up in parallel. So I put it up on Bible Works, and so I don't know if I pass an exam, but I put up the 3 windows, the Hebrew, the LXX, and the English. And when I get stuck, I look things up, or I actually cheat and look over the English. So
It served you well, sir. So
if it works, it's okay, right? That's totally my ethic, So whatever works is right. So I'm kidding, of course. Okay, so here we see the dates in Jeremiah, judgment and restoration. We want to get the big picture of Jeremiah, don't we? We have the nation is exiled for covenant violations, for forsaking the Torah. I think, if you're going to read, if you want to help people understand Jeremiah, just read chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a beautiful and powerful description of the nation's alienation from Yahweh. And what does he basically say? The nation is a whore. You're a harlot. You're married to Yahweh and you've abandoned him. So the sin is whoredom. Do you know about Ray Ortland's book, God's Unfaithful Wife? The first edition was titled Whoredom, but it didn't sell. And, the old days, I have a dinner like once a year if Ray's in town with Ray and Wayne Grudem and a couple other people. And I remember when Ray was writing the book, and obviously it's a serious book, but we'd say, what are you working on? And he said, I'm working on a book on whoredom, which is a very great book. But, finally the publisher said, people just aren't buying this book because it has the title Whoredom on it. But it's true, right? It's a great book. I recommend it to you. It's a good piece of biblical theology. What a good reminder that apostasy from the Lord, it's personal, right? It's a personal defection from God. He uses the image, they don't cling to Yahweh. And there he's using the image of underwear, right? The prophets, you never know what they're going to do. As underwear clings to you, that's how you were to cling to Yahweh, and they didn't do it. And of course, this shows up, they don't care for the poor, the aliens, the widows, the orphans. They're stealing, murder, adultery, lying, and idolatry. What do you think of when you hear that? This is a very simple question. What do you think of when you hear that? Stealing, murder, adultery, lying, and idolatry. The Ten Commandments, right? Clear, evident covenant violations. They offered their children in sacrifices. Oh, well, we don't do that today, do we? Or do we? Think of abortion, right? It's not convenient. The child's not convenient. It's not so different. The sin is like leopard spots. The sin is engraved on their hearts. He speaks, Jeremiah 4:23 through 26 is like a decreation. You know that passage? It's like the world's going back to not being created again because of Israel's sin. And of course, the nations are judged as well. So very powerful. Jeremiah has a lot of interaction with the leaders in Israel. Very personal book. He indicts kings, priests, prophets, and the wise. A lot of indictment of the kings, especially for social injustice. We see Jeremiah being persecuted. He's beat and imprisoned. They're lobbying for Jeremiah to be killed. People are saying he's preaching a false prophecy. It kind of makes sense. Jeremiah is saying, the Babylonians are going to win. We should surrender. And people said he's a traitor. He's betraying our nation. Those were the charges. He's actually, you imagine that in real life. He's actually dispiriting our army. Come on, we're in a battle. We have this guy over there saying surrender. But that's what God was saying, right? Surrender. Surrender. You're not going to win. You're because of your sin. And Jeremiah, often called the weeping prophet, Jeremiah basically says as well, I wish I were never born. He doesn't marry. He's a gentle lamb. He's not inflicting violence on others. At times he doesn't want to prophesy, but then he tells us the word of God is his joy. It just possesses him in such a way that he has to speak. Right? It just takes over his life. So through it all, the Lord protects them. He calls on the people to repent. That's the covenantal call. Break up your fallow ground. That's a nice picture of repentance. Or cut off the foreskin of their hearts, right? Another picture. other images are used. And then, like all the prophets, Jeremiah talks about a restoration. But why don't we talk about that after a break? Because we're going to go till, we're not going to go to 12:15 today. We're going to go to noon. So I have a lunch with Steve Lawson at 12. So, and he has to teach again at 1. So and that's fine. We can pick up time tomorrow and Saturday if we need it. Okay, so let's take a 10-minute break again.